Well, that went okay. I felt a little bit incoherent. I had so many clear, precise things that I wanted to say. I had thought about them, and then it just all vanishes. Gone completely from my mind as soon as I hop on stream with him. But I don't know. I think I didn't sound too incoherent.
If we have a given moral proposition,
I need to get better, though. Sitting before a camera and just talking is much easier than sitting before people live and having to say it right the first time.
Curious what,
you have so many ideas converging on your mind, and
but we
you want some of them to be expressed because they seem very relevant, but then
you
also want to stay on one kind of continuous, coherent track. Craig Biddle, Alex O'Connor. Let's see here.
Ability too, but we'll see how we do.
Wow, this internet's going
It's either
slow.
going to be respectable or it's going to turn into an atheist cage match. One or the other. We'll see where it goes. Well, let's do this. The topic is morality, objective or subjective. And why don't you start? Why don't you just give a 5-ish minutes, whatever works, on what your basic view is and why you hold it to be subjective or whatever the technical terms are that you're going to employ.
Fine by me. The terms can be a bit confusing, I think, objective and subjective. I'm usually careful to clarify that I'm not really a moral subjectivist, because subjectivism is a sort of theory of ethical truth that says things are true or false dependent on mental states. Things are true because you want them to be true, or in some way dependent on your desires or values or something like this. I broadly subscribe to an ethical view called Emotivism, which doesn't quite say this. What it says is that ethical...
What it says is that they're not actually truth-apt statements, right? Do I have a thing up for him? Okay, let's make a doc. Alex O'Connor versus Craig Biddle. Oh, no. Excuse me. Mamma mia. Okay, ethical subjectivism versus emotivism. I already have some docs on this. I made a YouTube video recently titled something like Destroying Alex O'Connor's Emotivism, or Response to Alex O'Connor's Emotivism. I think I changed the title to be less clickbaity after a commenter complained, and he was possibly right. But so I have a lot of working docs going on various ethical philosophies, but maybe reviewing a debate and specifically responding to the things they're saying can help give me a bit more structure, because I tend to ramble and my mind tends to branch off, and then I'll have like 3 working questions at one time, and then I'll try to make separate docs for each of them and try to fashion them into like fully polished scripts, and that usually ends up, then they're kind of incomplete, or sometimes I just don't do the best job at staying kind of focused. So I thought if I respond to a debate live, or whatever in the moment, it can potentially help me focus. Let's see.
Statements are expressions of emotion. So when you make an ethical statement, when you say that murder is wrong, you're expressing a kind of emotion. This is a view that's been popularly held by a number of people. It was, in the 20th century, most closely associated with A.J. Ayer and his philosophy of logical positivism, which has largely gone out of favor for being self-defeating and not capturing a lot of what philosophy is about. But I think that the emotivist part can be salvaged and remains a powerful critique to moral objectivism. To be clear, if you were to say murder is wrong, I think the best way of getting at what your metaethics is to translate that into a different phrase that doesn't use the word wrong, and see what you're actually trying to say. So murder is wrong, that might translate as something like, I don't like murder. That's not emotivism. That's moral subjectivism. Because to say I don't like murder is just to report a fact. It's just a fact. It's a true fact about my brain that I don't like murder. And so me saying murder is wrong, reporting that, would just be making a claim about my psychology. That's not what emotivism is. Emotivism says that when...
Okay, this is interesting. This is going to ultimately speak to my critique of emotivism, which is probably largely falls under the umbrella of my kind of existentialist or pragmatist philosophy. So a lot of my philosophy that seems to be emerging these days is what I think would be called a pragmatist philosophy. Things are defined and discussed and measured in terms of use, and often the kind of most real or ultimate meaning of a thing is discovered in the use of it and how we use it and how that informs, in turn, perhaps our perceptions and our conversations about it. That's just something to keep in mind. So pragmatist view of emotivism, like a pragmatist theory of truth, for example, shifts the focus from there's different theories of truth. There's pluralist theories of truth, correspondence theories of truth, which might be the one we'd most naturally think of. A correspondence theory of truth, I believe, is theories of truth. Let's see if I can take notes in a structured way that's still somewhat entertaining. Theories of truth. So correspondence theory of truth is the one I think we think of most instinctively, or the one we believe the word truth means as it's used in society most commonly. And that's a statement has truth value if it corresponds to a series of mind-independent or kind of verifiable facts. There's probably also verificationist theory of truth. That's probably a branch. Let me actually check. I don't know why my computer's been doing this. It hops to the full screen like a mad dog. Verificationist theories of truth. Theories of truth. So the correspondence theory of truth is a statement is true if it corresponds to a series or of facts, maybe just to a fact. So probably often must be mind independent in the sense of you can be discussing things that exist in minds, like emotions or anger or intent, but it has to be verifiable from an objective perspective, using the definition of anger, using the definition of mind, of what emotions do these neurotransmitters produce. That's not a good explanation at all. Let's see. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'm pretty sure correspondence theory. Aha, here it is. Correspondence theory of truth. The basic idea of the correspondence theory is that what we believe or say is true if it corresponds to the way things actually are, to the facts. One of the most annoying things about metaethics and ontology, metaphysics, is you get all this discussion. This is what Wittgenstein pointed out, all this discussion about what things mean. And you have reality, existence, being, facts. And then for some people, like Jordan Peterson sees facts as extremely limited. He sees the word fact as not encapsulating everything we want to discuss. He claims that Sam Harris's insistence that morality can be objective, or that everything can be objective, he claims that Sam Harris's insistence of that leads to a view which worships facts, which deifies facts and pretends we can discuss, even the ethos, even the meaning or value side of life in terms of facts. So Jordan Peterson says that's not a fact. When you say, they use the example of Elvis Presley's guitar. Elvis Presley's guitar is more meaningful, therefore, more valuable to humans at least, than a random guitar on the street. So you have this whole culture emerging about Elvis Presley's guitar. You have the stories we tell about Elvis Presley and who he was and the songs he would sing and what he represented. And then we try to model ourselves after him. And Jordan Peterson has also a very pragmatist philosophy based on, I would say, natural selection. We evolved this certain structure. We have this certain sort of society, this certain sort of language, this certain sort of appreciation for music. And all of these can be traced back to our patterns, to the things that make us up. We evolved to depend on these things for survival. And out of that is birthed this appreciation for music, this specific musician, Elvis Presley, his guitar. And we'll do a lot of crazy things because of his guitar that are not done about the elements that make up a guitar. Like, we don't just do that about random steel in the ground or random wood or whatever his guitar was made of. So this is, Jordan Peterson often talks about modes of being, things we act out. I would probably associate this with some sort of process philosophy, which often goes very hand in hand with pragmatism, I believe. And to my observation, it's not like I've heard someone say that. Actually, that's something I should research as well, process philosophy. Because that's not something process metaphysics, have I searched that before? Process metaphysics, process philosophy, process theism, metaphysics, process, which emphasizes the playing out of things. This is also a very kind of Kierkegaardian thing, which also, I've done a video on this, overlaps, to my view, with a lot of Eastern philosophies, by which, the self is not this static structure, but is this flowing, ongoing process. Kierkegaard says the self is a task, a process by which we kind of bring ourselves into alignment with God, with our intended nature. Easterners would probably not take such a hierarchical approach, but they would observe that consciousness, Sam Harris talks about this, seems to take whatever form the container dictates. So you have this specific brain and these particular neuronal nervous structures, and you have certain things that come, like light hitting my face and the painful memory of, remember yesterday when I was in the dark and I tripped and I was scared, there was a bear in the woods. And so you have this sort of very material reality around us in which our consciousness is nested. And because of how we've evolved, we're afraid of bears, we're afraid of the dark, we like the light, and we have this experience. But we don't kind of dictate any of that. We don't dictate our structure, and we don't dictate the emotions that our structure ongoingly produces or flows through. See, they would say our structure could be producing the emotions, but the consciousness itself, the awareness, the I am, they would say, is utterly formless. It's dictated entirely by the structure. It is actually inhabiting or flowing through the structure. The structure is not us. This is why they talk about the illusion of the self. And then there are different ideas, like the illusion of the self. Illusion of the self is probably more of a Buddhist thing. I'm going to get this wrong. And then Advaita Vedanta, is more of the formlessness of the self. Or is it the reverse? I don't remember. But you have certain, different tweaks they make. And some talk about, the more we come into alignment with understanding our true nature and how we suffer and how we desire and how we're motivated, the more we can control it, or the more we accept contentedly the control we lack. And so the better experience we will feel. And some people say that... that's a tangent. Okay, stay focused, Jesse. Man, see, I'm already all over the place. I need to learn to focus more on one thing when I'm doing a thing. And I started with Craig Biddle, Emotivism versus Subjectivism. Then I went to Views of Truth. I started researching, Googling those, and now process philosophy, and then the illusions of the self. So anyway, there's a lot of focus on modes of being or playing something out. A lot of people in Jordan Peterson's camp, pragmatists, process philosophers, meditators, talk about how the human brain likes to look at objects and likes to define them or articulate them as things, kind of with borders where this is a thing that exists outside of me and I can grab it and manipulate it and do certain things with it. But they say the human brain, because of how a priori, how deeply buried our motivations are, or our action, orientedness, we kind of tend to ignore the use feature, or the action, the flowing, ongoing verb feature that factors into what everything is. So things only appear as a microphone and as a cup and as a throwing object because of how we evolved to use them, because we can use them to survive. And when our brain is looking at the environment around us, this is all built in on such a subconscious level that we don't process that use feature as part of the thing. We just process the things, and our brain already knows what we will do with them. So when Jordan Peterson talks about a mode of being, this is what he means. He's talking about, this is why you conceptualize our impulses as gods. The Greek gods are the anger, the lust, the wisdom, the social pressure, the forces that hold sway over us and with which we have to negotiate. And we don't understand their every particle. We don't see them at the level of the particle. We evolve to see them as these faces, as these personalities with which, with a certain nature and a certain inclination and a certain, they stretch beyond what we can understand. So we're actually forced to negotiate with some kind of, not simulacrum, but, what does he say, Jordan Peterson? Low resolution picture of them. So I am rambling thoroughly now, but the idea is there's a lot of, is this the one with process philosophy? Yeah, so it must be emphasized that there's no universally accepted and precise definition of substance. Depending on how one understands the word or the concept, one might say either that Hume denied that there were any substances, or that he held that the only substances, or the only substances of which we have knowledge, were impressions and ideas. It would seem, however, that most philosophers who are willing to use the word substance at all would deny that any of the following, if they exist, are substances: universals and other abstract objects. So this could be like numbers. What other universals? Events, like energy and stuff. Events, processes, or change, but some metaphysicians contend that substance/event is a false dichotomy. Stuffs, such as flesh or iron or butter. So this is kind of composite things made up of many smaller things. Unfortunately, for beginning students of metaphysics, the usual meaning of substance outside philosophy is stuff. Aristotle criticized the natural philosophers for supposing that the proteousia could be a stuff, water or air or fire or matter. The nature of being, the problem of universals, and the nature of substance have been recognized as topics that belong to metaphysics by almost everyone who has used the word. We now turn to topics that belong to metaphysics only in the post-medieval sense. That has not much to do with process philosophy. Anyway, process philosophy is based on the premise that being is dynamic, and that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place within it. So you can't just talk about things. You cannot, in my case, just talk about mind-independent things. You cannot just talk about networks of inanimate things in relation to one another. No, you need to acknowledge how they move and interact. So in Buddhism, say, they have this thought experiment of the bell. Like, say there's a tree in a forest with a bell, and you are sitting on the ground meditating, and this wind comes up. So that's caused by disparate weather patterns or pressures in various parts of the atmosphere. This wind comes up and shakes the forest, shakes the tree, shakes the branch, shakes the bell. The bell creates a sound. Vibrations go through the air and hit your ear. Now, Buddhists observe that all of this is interdependent, so you cannot have any one element of it without the other. And our mind tends to feel like this is a frustratingly superficial view, or like this is a kind of dogmatic view, like you're defining things in such a way as to focus on how they're independent and kind of prove that, see, none of these things exist separate of the other, therefore they don't exist, or therefore they're illusions. Our mind tends to feel like this is kind of a trick that Buddhists say, or anyone can be doing, to try to prove the formlessness of being whatever, but our mind observes kind of naturally, that this is not how we naturally see the world, that we see a wind moving, shaking the tree, the bell, and we don't see vibrations in the air, but we hear the sound of the bell. It distracts our focus when we're meditating. We don't like that. We get up, we throw a rock at the bell, anger, whatever. So what's the point? The point is, all of this is interdependent, but when we would describe it as such, and we would say, okay, so the bell's not really a bell, it's just like this experience of a bell, because you have the people that made the bell, and if they made it with the intent of making a bell, then that's one thing, and that's dependent on them and the culture and the society. And then whoever hung it on the tree decided to hang it on the tree for certain reasons. And then you're the sort of being that meditates and that sits in this sort of forest and has this sort of ear to hear the bell. And all of it is nested in this... Oh, shoot. All of it is Oh, shoot. I just totally lost my chain of thought. Sorry. What's the point? Process philosophers would observe that this is dynamic. So the identity that we attribute to each of these things is kind of a tool we use. It's a lens that we force the world into, that we force information into in order to be able to perceive it and discuss it, but that the actual, perhaps, nature itself is all these patterns just in constant flux and interaction. So does that make it an illusion, as maybe some Easterners would say? We don't know. What do we mean by illusion? Can an illusion be useful? Does illusion imply something deceptive or negative, counter-useful? Can an illusion be as fully meaningful? If it's an illusion, but its maximal meaning is found there, and all conscious beings experience meaning primarily through illusion, then is it really illusion? The pragmatist or the existentialist, Peterson, perhaps, comes along and says, no, that's not illusion. That's what we mean when we say real. We mean this experience. The experience is the only thing we can kind of directly know. So process philosophy is based on the premise that being is dynamic, and that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place within it. Even though we experience our world and ourselves as continuously changing, Western metaphysics has long been obsessed with describing reality as an assembly of static individuals, so that's what I was trying to say, whose dynamic features are either taken to be mere appearances or ontologically secondary and derivative. So this is interesting. And this is kind of the postmodernist and the existentialist response to like the hyper-analytical Enlightenment thought, which was trying to divide everything up. purely, rationally, and separate it, look at it through a microscope, connect the dots like this and this, and there's a dimension that you cannot cross between you and what you are studying. And process philosophers probably observe that, or I at least would observe, that this kind of tears the meaning out of the thing, and you can never describe what anything is. This is what terrified us so much. You can never describe what anything is without accepting a priori, as Peterson would say, this structure that is us, that has emerged because of natural selection, by which we see the things we see and want to study the things that we want to study and are motivated to do with them, the sorts of things we are motivated to do with them. So this is what the postmodernists were so terrifyingly suggesting or observing, is that everything seems to be fluid and subjective, and it can boil down to these narratives about, whatever you're trying to do with something, you can't actually align it with anything good, because even your conceptualization of good is determined by your genes and your culture and all these preconditional things that influence what you want. So this is, I think, what Peterson's trying to say when he says this hyperfixation on rationalism leads to postmodernism and leads to the abandonment of meaning as an ethos, or the whatever he says, the voluntary adaptation, adopting of suffering. So Peterson looks at Foucault and looks at Derrida, and he says, wow, and Marx or whatever, the postmodern neo-Marxists led to this new world by which nothing can mean anything, and by which compassion, just broadcasting impulse compassion, is the highest value, or by which everything is about power. Whatever he says, it's unconstrained by the structure of being, the realistic structure of being determined by our evolution, by which we must, accept suffering in order to better ourselves, because more suffering will come, and by which we must, temper or constrain compassion with truth. You speak truth in the spirit of love. You can't just speak compassion to everyone and affirm them. This is what he always talks about when he says, it's not your job as a therapist to just affirm everything everyone says. That's his, primary concern with, I guess, some of the modern trans stuff that he thinks is going on. I haven't looked into it. So Peterson looks at the postmodernists and says they led to this, and then he says and Nietzsche is another example. He says Nietzsche was wrong about Christianity because Nietzsche didn't understand some fundamental thing about the shouldering of responsibility, and Nietzsche was too focused on the master-slave morality and doesn't understand human motivation. So Nietzsche's critiques of Christianity were incomplete because he didn't understand it, and therefore when Nietzsche predicted that Christianity would lead to postmodernism, he was wrong. We've gotten postmodernism because of other things. And then, atheists or militant atheists, anti-Christian arguers will say, Nietzsche was totally right. Christianity led to this. It's this slave morality. It's this fear-based or victim-based thing by which you try to revere the one thing that makes you weak, in order to isolate yourself from the suffering or from the call to courageous, honest self-expression. Because if you were courageous and honest, you would express yourself, exert yourself over your environment, and you might have to destroy some things in that process, and you aren't strong enough to do that, so you try to find some justification and some demonization of those who do exercise strength over their environment. So everywhere you see people looking at certain arguments and saying, I understand this, and it's wrong, and it will lead to this. Nietzsche said he understood Christianity and it would lead to bad. Peterson says Nietzsche was wrong because Peterson looks at Christianity and says it will lead to good. So everyone takes kind of their view, their understanding of what something is, and works with that and gets to some sort of conclusion. And what Wittgenstein observed is that a lot of the confusion when we talk about things is that we're all using different words to mean different things, or we're all using the same words to mean different things. So if two people sit down to talk about what did Christianity lead to, did it lead to something better or worse, they need to first define what is Christianity, how, what parts of it have actually had a substantive effect. Like, is it the philosophers? Are they the core of Christianity? And, how much have they influenced culture versus the greedy politicians in the Middle Ages who tried to do deals with the church to maintain their power? How much have the commoners influenced the true legacy of Christianity? How much is it the dogmatic wing of Christianity versus the more thoughtful, progressive way? Is it what Jesus actually wanted, or is it, how it manifested in the Inquisition, or how it manifests today in the evangelical West? So you have a lot of different understandings of Christianity, and when you sit down and try to discuss what Christianity means. You have to agree, and this is probably where a lot of the argument takes place. What is Christianity? What is the religion? What is the essence of it? And then you get to the current day and you have to say, okay, now, what do we want? What's our goal? How would we determine whether things are better or not? And that's, oh boy, what was I talking about? Oh, that's where a lot of the confusion comes, because you have different features that the different thinkers focus on in each ideology. So Nietzsche focused on XYZ amount of part of Christianity. Peterson focuses on another part of it. And then people look at Peterson focuses on the postmodern neo-Marxists and their radical dismissal of truth, or the dismissal of the idea of objective truth. And he says, they were observing that we cannot have a consensus on truth, and that we cannot have a consensus on anything of value. It's all determined, or it's all, determined by power, because whoever wins, and then everyone kind of adopts their mentality and joins the herds that they survive. And so the postmodern neo-Marxists were response to this hyper-rationality that tried to separate us from everything and study it very enlightenmentally, very rationalistically, and say we can understand reality and we can explain everything as long as we divorce ourselves from the equation and, follow the scientific method. The postmodernists realized, or we started to realize, that there's all these a priori perceptual structures inside of us by which even the concepts we see, the language we use, the words, the things we hold in our head, everything we try to do in terms of motivation is based on this evolved structure that's so far beneath us, we can't interrogate it. We can't really critique it. We're just helpless, acting it out. So they said, everything is fluid, everything's sociological, everything's whatnot. And Peterson looks at this and he says, oh, this is terrible. This is going to lead to the abandonment of truth, and that's going to destroy society, because there is a truth. The truth is, how we evolved does require that we have suffering, and that we have the idea of the good, and that we speak compassion, yes, but with truth and with firm, judgment. So Peterson looks at postmodernism and says, this is where it led us. What was I talking about? Hello, the intelligent milk jug. There's a big delay, so I don't know how to get the chat up on the computer. I'm trying to figure out how things work. And I'm very hopeless. I don't even know how. Oh, I didn't put the stream call, the invite in the chat, did I? Let's see. I can send, I don't know if you popped on because you wanted to hop on the Discord chat or not. You don't have to, don't feel pressured to at all. But I realized that I said, come chat with me in the title of the stream, and then I never actually attached the link. So that's the link. If you want to talk about philosophy or something, I need to figure out how to live stream better, because I just kind of ramble and I lose track. I lose my place. My mind just goes all over the place and then forgets what it's talking about. There's probably a delay. Process philosophy is based on the premise that being is dynamic, and the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place within it. Even though we experience our world and ourselves as continuously changing, Western metaphysics has long been obsessed with describing reality as an assembly of static individuals whose dynamic features are either taken to be mere appearances or ontologically secondary and derivative. So everything is about nodes, discrete nodes, say particles, mathematics, information, interacting separate from the observation of the subject. And the mind then comes and imposes its kind of flawed, we would say, perceptions. And then Peterson, or me perhaps, would say, no, the interpretation of these particles as a glass with water in it that I can drink is not an illusion, does not lead away from truth, does not deceive us, but rather informs us as to something within us that is also a part of reality, a legitimate part of reality. And indeed, the only sort of things we can care about, the only sort of things that are meaningful to discuss, are as they relate to us. So when we say we are beings that evolved to need water, to build glasses, to break glasses, This is an observation we make informed by who we are and our structure, and this is not an observation you can make separate from yourself, just looking at things in the empirical rationalist way. So this is where you get the idea of an underlying ethos, a why, a value by which you must align according to which you must align your truth-seeking, your science, your logic. So for process philosophers, the adventure of philosophy begins with a set of problems that traditional metaphysics marginalizes or even sidesteps altogether. What is dynamicity or becoming? An example of this would be potential and reality. What is potential energy? What is potential intelligence? If I'm born with the potential to be very smart, but I spend all my time sitting inside rambling, am I going to realize that potential? Was that intelligence a real thing, that potential intelligence? Or, if the universe was always set, if everything's deterministic and just playing out, all these particles cascading, bumping into one another, then that intelligence was never real. So that's probably not the best example because, well, okay. Let's see. If it is the way we experience reality, how should we interpret this metaphysically? Are there several varieties of becoming? For instance, the uniform going on of activities versus the coming about of developments. Yeah, when does something become a development? When does the pieces of wood I'm working with become a chair? Is a chair even a thing? This leads to mereological nihilism, by which nothing is real. Do all developments have the same way of occurring, quite independently of what is coming about? How can we best classify into different kinds of occurrences? How can we understand the emergence of apparently novel conditions? Can we conceive of becoming like wetness? Water produces wetness, an emergent property. When do individual molecules of water become wet? Can we conceive of becoming or dynamic being independently of space and time? I would say no. We evolved utterly, absolutely, to be dependent on space and time. Space and time, or at least causality. Space-time, I need to research that. Space-time versus causality. Can humans conceive of one without the other? I don't think so. I believe reason, the very way we think, all possibility for coherence and sense, whatever, and obviously, therefore, conversation or discussion, thought, discussion, is dependent on causality. I think causality is basically inseparable, synonymous with reason. Causality is how we perceive. Not only reason, perception. Yeah, perception. Reason. Causality is how we perceive. I'll have to think about those, but I'm probably going to work on a script dealing in one way or another with the human view of causality and reason, and how we often appeal to, I believe, circular arguments, like in they're going to get there here. Emotivism, value space is real from a phenomenological perspective, from an existential, say, pragmatist, existential perspective. Value space is real. Value space is comprised not only of neutral or non. Let's not call it value space. Let's call it experience space. Phenomenological space. Phenomenological space. Phenomenological. Holy cow. Phenomenological space is comprised not only of neutral or non-value qualia, such as red or green, because I can't think of one that's not a color, because everything seems so tied to value, but also tied to value-centric qualia, such as music, because even music, implies value immediately. Music, wistfulness, and indeed, one step further, morality. So there are things you could possibly argue we don't value, but simply perceive. Maybe this would include electrons, etc. Now, there's an argument to be made that electrons are particles that exist objectively outside of us, but actually, that's even stranger. when you get into quantum stuff. We're not actually sure what electrons are. They're like clouds of possibility. They're not actually particles. Who knows? So you could argue possibly that there are things we don't value but simply perceive. I think it's very difficult. The postmodernists would probably agree that it's very difficult. Peterson would agree. We have this evolved structure. It produced this. The very way we see the world reflects that, and it's underneath. It undergirds the perception itself. So then you have things we value, but which we wouldn't call moral, such as pleasing music, I guess, although we'd probably say that's moral. Pleasing music, a peaceful butterfly, a sunset. Then you have things we do value and we do call moral, such as a person working hard to play said music, a person choosing not to kill said butterfly, a mother sacrificing her life for her child. Now, you get to the point where observing that all of these things kind of exist in the phenomenological space, they're all dependent on the mind dependent. You get to the point where some of these people say that aesthetics are just ethics. All things that we would assign a moral weight to can really just be reduced to, well, we evolved to prefer this thing, preference. This is probably the emotivist argument. I don't know if they would phrase it that way exactly. But again, this is where I feel like, and this is where Wittgenstein observes, a lot of the confusion emerges. I have my certain view of reality, and I consider phenomenology experiences to be real, and therefore I experience the value space to be real and undeniable. It's indeed one of the only directly, knowable things. And so, by that metric, I would say not only is green a real thing, and not only is the experience of music a real thing, but pleasure and pain, preference, are real things. And preference can only ever be as it is. A thing is desirable because it is desired. In the words of John Stuart Mill, a thing is painful because it is. This is the point at which you have to just say, we know what pain is because we experience it. The confusion or disagreement expressed potentially by someone like Alex, how do we know pain is real? How do you know? How can you say it's an objective bad if it's just a preference? I would say what we mean when we say bad can only ever relate to this value space that depends on the phenomenological. So what we mean when we say pain is bad can only ever relate to the reality of pain. In this case, bad is the word that implies morality. Pain is not the word, not a word that implies pain. It's not a word that suggests or pleads the existence of a painful experience. It's not a word that tricks us into thinking, or there's some subjective quality of pain that appears from a certain point of view, but not another. Because that's what we often mean when we say something is subjective. We often mean, or feel we mean, that it is one way from a certain point of view, but could be another from another. When we say something is subjective, we usually seem to be suggesting something like it can be contradicted from another point of view, or there is no useful way to verify it or to agree upon it across all individuals or whatever who are a part of the discussion, So when we say something is subjective, and this is, again, perhaps, Alex would have a different definition of the word subjective, and he would have a different definition of probably what bad might mean, and he, has his different word games, and so then we'd have to sit down and we'd have to work them out and figure out, okay, this is where the clash is. He thinks an experience appears in the mind, that it's very real and we will act upon it. But he's just observing that when we say it's bad, we're simply expressing how we're going to act, and we're not actually discussing some sort of entity of goodness that exists independent of us. And I would say, okay, if we're discussing how we're going to act, if the experience is real in our mind, then I'm observing whatever, regardless of whether or not you want to call it an entity outside of you. This word bad is the word we use interacting with all these other beings who are also having mental, experiences of bad, and their actions and ours are going to coincide or not coincide, and we're trying to figure out what to do. And this discussion is going to function as long as we use the word bad. And what we refer to, you can say it doesn't mean a bad thing outside of us objective, but we're referring to, or what it relates to, is this painful experience, which is very real. And so maybe bad is just a shorthand thing we use, a shorthand term we use to capture kind of all of that. And affirming that, or not affirming it, doesn't affect the reality of the painful experience. The painful experience is the only thing we ever mean when we say bad. So this loops back to what I was saying above. So, preference, on the subjectivity of preference. I don't want to get sidetracked. So, well, there's 2 people watching, so if I'm getting sidetracked, let me know. Let me know if I am rambling too much, or if there's something more interesting to talk about. I need to figure out how to just stay focused, definitely, when I stream, if this is going to be a regular thing. Because I can talk about politics. I could go back to reviewing the debate in a much more focused way, hopefully. I could research mythology because I'm outlining a novel based on Irish mythology, which I probably want to stream. I'm not sure if it's something people are interested in. But anyway, this is probably the emotivist argument. So bad is the word that implies morality. I'm responding to that. I'm saying, what was I saying? Emotivism. From an existential point of view, phenomenological space is real. Phenomenological space is comprised not only of neutral or non-value qualia, such as red or green, but also tied to value-centric qualia, such as music, wistfulness, and indeed, one step further, morality. So there are things you could possibly argue we don't value, but simply perceive. Maybe this is like electrons, maybe colors. Then you have things we value, but which we wouldn't call moral, such as pleasing music, a peaceful butterfly, a sunset, aesthetically arranged colors. Why are they aesthetically arranged? That reveals something deeper about us. Then you have things we do value and you do call moral, such as a person working hard to play said music, a person choosing not to kill said butterfly, a mother sacrificing her life for her child. So these preferences describe a real phenomenological reality that is just mind dependent. Alex is concerned that this mind dependence, or he's observing that this is mind dependent and therefore not objective. I'm saying something like, bad is the word that implies morality. Pain is not a word that implies pain. It's not a word that suggests or pleads the existence of a painful experience. It's not a word that tricks us into thinking there's some subjective quality of pain that appears from a certain point of view, but not another. No. Saying pain exists in a mind is to say the experience of pain, this experience, this slapping self experience is real. It is ongoing. It is separate from the word we use to attempt to describe it. It is separate from your opinion on whether or not it is ongoing. It is separate from your desire, or lack thereof, for me to escape pain. Pain is ongoing. So the word bad we attach to morality, ought. But pain is an is descriptor. I'll also note that Hume himself didn't give much attention to the is-ought divide. It was kind of like a side note he wrote at one point, and it's taken off, obviously, but it wasn't necessarily something that troubled him for reasons I can get into later. Pain is ongoing. So pain is not a word like bad that implies something, some concept. Morality tends to appeal to, I guess, something outside of the mind. That's Alex's criticism. Pain is a word that implies only, or that captures only what is actually ongoing. It's purely descriptive, purely... Pain is ongoing, purely descriptive, purely ought. Not ought, is. Because that's what we often mean when we say something is subjective. We often feel we mean, that it is one way from a certain point of view, but it could be another from another. When we say something is subjective, we usually seem to be suggesting something like it could be contradicted from another point of view, or there's no useful way to verify it or to agree upon it across all individuals or whatever who are part of the discussion. So, maybe between Alex and Craig Biddle, this is going to come up, maybe not, but what do we mean when we say something is subjective? Does this have a practical effect on what we do, how we discuss things, how we value, etc.? So, is our understanding of the world, our understanding of the world, is our understanding of the world actually affected? Is our understanding of the world actually affected by our definition, or by the observation that something is subjective? What do we mean when we say something is subjective? Because there are different sorts of ways we use this. We can say a piece of music is, subjectively pleasing, like it pleases certain people, maybe who grew up to appreciate it in their culture, and it offends others who grew up in an enemy culture. So this is a subjective thing. Is a piece of music good? Subjectively, you can observe that, what's the Russian song? Katyusha. You guys know that one? Na 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 na. So, you can observe that Katyusha is good if you are Russian and have strong feelings of patriotism or nostalgia for the good old days, etc. You can feel that it is bad subjectively if you are Kazakh or whatever, I don't know, Kazakh or whatever, and were oppressed by said song. You can feel it as bad subjective if you're Kazakh or whatever and were oppressed by said song. So we can say this is a subjective judgment because the value associated with said song is different in different minds. But can you say that the pleasure or pain itself, the preference itself, is subjective? What does that mean? It is a subjective sort of thing in that it appears in minds. It is mind dependent, much in the same way as colors or emotions. But the preference itself simply is. This is what Sam Harris means. This is what Sam Harris means when he says phenomenology, I guess. That's not the word he uses, but phenomenology is a brute fact of our existence. So we can say this is a subjective judgment because the value associated with said song is different and said in different minds. But can you say that the pleasure or pain itself, the preference itself, is subjective? It is a subjective sort of thing that appears in minds, but that's not what we mean when we say subjective in this case. So this is where Sam complains about the conflation between two uses of the word subjective. ontological and epistemological. The ontological state regarding the song is either pain or pleasure in one mind or another. The epistemic state regarding the song is a question of who we are speaking to, what we know about their minds, how they convey the pain or pleasure, etc., etc., etc. Epistemic has to do with language, communication, the sorts of minds we have access to. Ontological has to do with the actual state of ongoing experience. So we've established colors, supposing they're neutral, non-value connected. We've established value things like anger, fear, pleasing music, pleasure and pain. And then the next jump is to morality. So Alex would agree probably that pain and pleasure are real, but he would say that doesn't imply anything about morality. Describing pain is just describing a state of things, just describing an arrangement of particles. That's not going to tell me what I should do. There is no should we can impose upon being. Now, I would observe, and Craig Biddle, I believe, observes, what I've been discussing, where I would observe that this is simply a brute fact, a brute feature of our experience. It is nested wholly in our structure, i.e. we evolved to have this brain on this planet, to hear sounds, to hear music, to associate it with certain things. We evolved, given our evolved structure, this pleasure is a brute fact of our existence. And good is the word we use to describe this. When we say something is good, we mean it is to be pursued. So again, this is pragmatist theory of truth. Remember that through line here. Pragmatist theory of truth and Wittgensteinian confusion. Wittgenstein said something like there are no philosophical problems, only problems of other things, of, for example, language. So the pragmatist theory of truth shifts the focus on what is said. You know, does this statement correlate with some set of facts, to what do we mean, what is intended when we make this statement. I'll get to that soon, pragmatist theory of truth. But when we say something is good, we mean it is to be pursued. When we say something is good, we mean it is to be pursued. We can only ever be discussing, only ever be functioning in this world of preference and what we are going to do about it. So you say something is good to a certain set of minds, and they will agree because they are similar. Say a certain set of Russian minds. You say a song, Katyusha, is good to a certain set of Russian minds, and they will agree because they are similar enough. Yes, materially, yes, objectively, to have this actual state, this existing ontological state of pleasure in listening to Katyusha. The only thing we ever mean when we say good is this thing of pleasure, of preference being satisfied. So Alex probably says something like, very well, fine. That's what we mean when we say good, but it's simply describing a subjective state, a state of preference appearing in one mind. Emerging, not appearing. Generated, emerging in one mind. All I, Alex, am doing is observing that it's not a material thing, not an objective thing. When we make a moral statement like Katyusha is a good song, we should listen to Katyusha, we are simply expressing this preference. An emotion of goodness, yay, is associated with Katyusha, and we are expressing this. There is no morality, there is no imperative, there is no ought. I, Jesse, am saying we use the term good, or should, we should listen to this, as shorthand to describe all this host of things that are going on beneath the surface. We have these similar minds. We are all Russian. We all remember the good old days. If we play this song, we will find our spirits lifted, blah, blah, blah. So I would say it does have propositional truth value. It is a truth apt statement. It is a truth apt statement. It is a proposition. I am suggesting if we do this, our experiences will be better. If we do this, our experiences will be better. This is not making the leap from is to ought. It is observing that the only thing we can ever discuss, the only thing we can ever mean when we say ought, is informed by what is. What is, is our structure, our phenomenological structure, our brain. Yeah. So it remains purely in the realm of is, and this is Harris's point, and this is a point many meditators make, because I think there's something about the practice of meditation that shifts your attention a little bit away from this rationalism, this materialism. I'm able to talk. I don't know why I've been typing all this time, because that's probably kind of slow and boring to listen to. But what I'll probably do is write a script and then re-record it as a script and then make like a polished video, and this will just stay as a live stream. So yeah, I would say, and this is a very pragmatist type of thing too, everything we do and say is informed by this underlying evolved structure that just dictates what we want and what motivates us. Let's see. I think that was a fairly consistent line of thought. I don't know. So bad implies morality. Pain is not a word that implies pain. It's not a word that suggests or pleads the existence of a painful experience. The experience is there. Pain is simply the word we use to describe it. Bad. So what is bad? What do we mean when we say morality? Alex is saying we try to give it some sort of weight. We try to give it some sort of ought, overarching thing, distinct from the experience itself of pain. And we pretend like that can shape a moral worldview in a kind of a new way or a different way. We pretend that we can impose a moral worldview on someone. As if we could only agree on some sort of objective framework of morality outside of us, we might be able to impose it on everyone. I would say we can already do that if we just acknowledge where our brains overlap and where they don't. We can measure well-being where it appears and where it doesn't, and where different cultures come into conflict. You're going to have certain groups experiencing pleasure while others experience pain. Oh no, what do you do? What's the best thing to do? You just, I guess, have to maximize pleasure. And this starts to sound like a very utilitarian argument, which concerns people because it sounds so rigid and godless or cold, because you don't have any sort of you're not appealing to any sort of words. See, I would say you're not appealing to any of the sort of words we associate with some like warm and fuzzy feeling of security or some overarching feeling of objective purpose, design, duty, charity. A lot of deontologists talk about, the duties of generosity, of charity, of responsibility, of justice, and they can actually differ in some way from mere, whatever brute well-being or preference. And so that's often more appealing, but I would suggest that it's more appealing because of the sorts of things we associate with these words: charity, generosity. It means, a society you trust. It means a family you can rely on. It means you're nested properly in all of this stuff, which is a matter of preference and is, determined by our evolved structure. So I would say we have all these words that we use to categorize kind of different nodes or branches along this network. But a lot of them are used just as tools to communicate. And when we're discussing what should be done, it can only ever mean that which is preferred. That which is preferred regardless of the mind. A bee would have a different sense of morality because it prefers, the workers are less valuable than the queen. So I don't know if the queens are actually capable of much more pleasure or pain or meaning or whatever. But and then you have the question of meaning. How much suffering produces meaning as opposed to just like being hooked up to a ambrosia machine all the time and you're just in a state of euphoria. Is that truly meaningful? Well, we could go in and we could look and see where actual sacrifice and hard work and dedication produces a deeper form of happiness. We would call that meaning, and that would be factored into this too. But it all has to do with affirming this phenomenological space, affirming that experience is the ground of being. Experience is the most directly knowable thing, the only thing we can verify. So what was all that about? From an existential point of view, phenomenological space is real. Reason, the very way we think, all possibility for coherence and sense, and obviously therefore conversation, thought, discussion, is dependent on causality. I think causality is basically I don't remember exactly. How did I get there? Process philosophy. Well, let's just do the debate.
When you say murder is wrong, you are expressing the dislike itself. So saying murder is wrong is not the same thing as saying I don't like murder. It's expressing the dislike. So A.J. Ayer famously had it as murder is wrong translates roughly to something like boo murder. You can think of it as the difference between saying murder and saying murder.
This is an interesting distinction, but this does lead to what we're talking about, where you have expressing the dislike, boo, murder, and then you have claiming or stating that I dislike murder. So and they do this because this is, say, the moral subjectivist view, and it's truth apt. You can say I dislike murder, and it's expressing something that's either true or false about yourself. Now, that's not the same thing as saying murder is wrong, but it's expressing something that's either true or false about your brain. Expressing the dislike, boo murder, isn't even truth apt. It's not something that is a claim about the structure of being, like murder will produce suffering in me. It's more just, I don't feel good about murder. Yeah.
Murder is wrong is like the difference between writing down murder and then writing down murder with an exclamation mark and an angry emoji. It adds something. It tells you something about the mental state of the person you're speaking to, but it doesn't add anything propositional. It doesn't change. It's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. This is the most radical thing about emotivism. It means that moral claims don't have truth value. They can't be true and false. The emotivist recognizes that if you pay attention to what's going on when you have a moral feeling, when you see a homeless person being kicked for no reason, what happens in your brain? Well, you see.
The language here is so important, so you have to pay attention to the sorts of words we use, because they're all weighted kind of differently. They're all kind of textured to associate with, either something cold and rigidly utilitarian, or something descriptive, amoral, that's just describing the way of things, or something, warm and fuzzy and, existence does have a purpose and we're aligning ourselves with it. So when he says, when you what did he say? Describe a moral feeling?
You see a homeless attention to what's going on when you have a moral.
If you pay attention to what's going on when you have a moral feeling. So it's important that he chose the word feeling. And then, you'll have to get down the line, you'll have to get into a discussion regarding, okay, it's very good, though. It's very good to just say, if you pay attention to what's going on. I mean, this is what the Harris types do. And they say, just to what it's like to have an experience. That's when Harris arrives at this brute fact of preference can only be ever as it is. Desire can only ever be that which is desired. Something can be pleasurable. Something is pleasurable because it is that which produces pleasure. Like these are really axioms. They're not axioms. It's not circular in the way of incoherence when you say, like, what is a window? Oh, a window's a window. That's useless. That's circular. That's illogical in a debate because you're just trying to define window. But when you talk about pain or pleasure, these experiences that are manifest self-evident in the mind, the Harris claim would be you don't need to define them, refer them to something else, because this is the ground space of their existence. This is the ground from which they emerge. You can talk about the particles that produce them, but as soon as you describe the particles and the networks, this network of particles and neurotransmitters and this and that producing an experience of, and you're still going to have to appeal to the experience. So the experience is the ground reality. That's what is so useful about saying, if you pay attention to what's going on, or if you ask yourself what it would really mean to experience free will, or this is why it's useful to look at things that way.
When you see a homeless person being kicked for no reason, what happens in your brain? Well, you've seen a set of objective facts. You can say a person has been kicked. That's true. It doesn't do anything moral. You could say, I don't like that this person has been kicked. That's reporting a psychological fact. Again, nothing moral, you're just stating facts. But there's this added element, there's this added thing that you feel, and it's something like don't. It's something like stop. It's something like boo. All of these things are not things that can have truth value.
Yeah, and this is good. So when I say pain, when I, Jesse, say pain is self-evident and manifest, Alex is correct that this is purely descriptive. And we feel, when we say something is bad, that there's this added quality of don't or stop. Excuse me. Stop, though, is a yell. A yell. An expressed desire is not an articulate, truth-apt claim itself. It is not an imperative in the sense of you should do this, or even if you do this, then XYZ things will be better. It's not then, to Alex, truth apt. Truth apt. It's not even really a proposition.
They're emotions. One of the ways that I would describe this is to imagine that we didn't have a word for anxiety, the feeling of anxiety. Imagine there was just no such word for it, and you were feeling anxious, and you were trying to describe to somebody how you felt. And you would say, well, it's a bit like being sad, but it's kind of like being excited at the same time. It would be difficult to explain. You could offer these analogies, but it's its own unique feeling. And what we've done is we've sort of identified that.
Now, I would say you can only ever describe any of these by affirming this phenomenological space. Experience. It's kind of like anger. It's kind of like nervousness. It's kind of like sadness. You can only ever discuss this reality by affirming the phenomenological space and acknowledging that these words are tools we use to describe something that is real.
Feeling and given it a name, which is anxiety. Now, that thing that you feel, that thing that makes things you consider to be immoral different from other kinds of events, whatever that thing is, I think we've also identified that emotion, put a label on it, and that label is good or bad or right and wrong, virtuous, not virtuous, these kinds of terms. I think they have.
Okay, and this is probably where I would say we even agree. I probably agree with the emotivist that good and bad and so on are labels we use to describe these phenomenological preferences or textures that landscape our mind. I guess it's probably just a difference of language in the end, which was the point I tried to make in my first video, which got generally good response, but there were several comments saying that I hadn't explained things well or that I rambled too much, which is probably true. But particularly a couple comments saying that I didn't understand emotivism, or I didn't understand the cognitivism, non-cognitivism distinction, which emotivism is a form of non-cognitivism. Cognitivism would be you're making truth-apt statements, actual propositions when you describe morality. Deontology would often fall under cognitivism. I got those comments. And what I was trying to do in the video, when I started out especially, there was one point at which I said, cognitivism simply describes, what did I say? I'm not going to remember it exactly. What is going on with this? It's slow. Jesse Tate responding to Alex O'Connor, emotivism. Instincts atop it, trying to kind of prod and poke from a new perspective, which means with new words, and it keeps evolving, but I'm not sure. Cognitivism claims, asserts. Where is it in the transcript? Oh, that guy probably made a comment. Oh yeah, here it is.
Comes up with this, or you're saying, I like charity, or I don't like murder. Because those things can be true or false. They have truth value. It could be true that it is just a psychological fact that I don't like murder. He means murder is wrong. That statement is just the expression of the emotion.
Yep.
Boo, murder. And I think...
I'd say emotivism describes a pretty similar thing, the same thing as some form of utilitarian cognitivism. One just observes that subjective experience is, surprise, surprise, a subjective thing, while the other describes a bit more directly or maybe comprehensively the nature of the subjective, the way the subject must be. Let me explain. Non-cognitivism observes that we describe the subjective features of experience, not of the objective world. Cognitivism affirms the desire. So, as I was doing this, and I agree with the commenters that perhaps I didn't introduce and, expand as comprehensively as I should have, I was really going at it probably from my pragmatist perspective of, okay, there seems to be a lot of confusion over language. We say there's a difference between, morality and preference because we prefer things, we prefer pleasure, but that doesn't have an ought attached to it. It's just describing the way things are, the way our brains are. And then as soon as we say we should do something where we feel like we want there to be some extra weight, like some morality that exists independent of us that, can compel others to do this and can make us all agree and give us a feeling of harmony or something. But I believe that a lot of that is just confusion or illusion. I believe the only things we can ever mean when we discuss what we should do are, given the array of possible choices in front of us, given what we know about our brains, whatever will produce the most well-being for us or the most pleasure is the thing we will choose to do if we know to do it, and we should try to figure that out. And when we discuss it, we have these different words like loyalty and honor and sacrifice that we use as tools to try to discuss it more coherently. But what we're really trying to get at is this reality that exists outside of us and this reality that exists in here. And this reality will filter the matter outside of us into something we want or something we don't want. And I'm just observing, I feel like I'm observing that that's the only thing we can ever mean. So perhaps I agree with Alex that we can be just describing the way things are, and it doesn't give this strange overarching kind of undefined sense of morality. But I would say that the only thing we can ever mean when we use the word good in the Sam Harris way is that which is good, that which is experienced, in Sam's words, well-being, happiness, bliss, meaning, whatever sort of word you want to use. We feel like the words kind of degrade it because it's like, oh, happiness, there's so many other facets that we're used to using, so many other labels we're used to using that kind of are held in tension with happiness. But whatever we are pursuing when we pursue the good, it can only ever be that sort of thing as it manifests in conscious space in the mind. So I guess practically, from the pragmatist point of view, I would say nothing in the conversation changes. You just acknowledge that you're describing the way things are, and then you move forward to discuss what we should do. A Christian probably would feel like there's something lost if you give up this idea of a, divinely ordained morality. There's something lost, like reality will end up worse in some way. But I would say the only way you can ever discuss that, or the only kind of way you could meaningfully prove that would be discussing God's will and our structure, and if we give up the idea of charity as distinct from